This is Computing Up, conversations about computation writ large with Michael Littman and Dave Ackley. This episode was recorded April 29th, 2024. Computing Up sincerely regrets the extreme publication delay, but much of the discussion is about the history of computing and still holds up here in 2025. We hope you enjoy it.
I'm so glad it's getting to be nice weather out again.
It's we didn't really have very much nasty weather. Did you guys have nasty weather?
So, right. So you're in Albuquerque. I'm in Virginia. Virginia, definitely less of the nasty, but we did have a big snow this year. And, but I think mostly my wife is very sensitive to sunshine. Like she says she's solar powered. So once the sun starts to come out, she,
perks up. She starts to bloom.
yeah, so she
That's
feels better.
amazing. I'm laughing because I describe myself that way, and I've never heard anyone else use that particular phrase.
Solar power.
Well, let me make sure that we bring you in. So this is everybody. This is Joy Rankin. I first learned about Joy, I think, when I was in contact with MIT about various kinds of computing outreach efforts that was going on, and she was working at MIT. And had written a book on the people's history of computing. And people said to me, you should read this book. And I read this book, and it was just so eye-opening. It was a delight to read. Her voice came through loud and clear. So much interesting stuff. Like, I feel like I was aware of all this in the past, but no, there was all kinds of details and all kinds of angles to it that were just so great to read about. So Joy, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me to be here. I am delighted. Yes.
I'm so glad. And you are also solar powered.
I am solar powered. I very much need to be in the sunshine. I am currently in Durham, North Carolina, where it is much sunnier than places of my previous residence, whether it was Massachusetts for MIT or Michigan or Connecticut, New York. So I'm happy to be here.
That's super funny. Super funny. Because so when I finished my PhD in computer science at Brown University, and I was on the job market and I was looking for places to go, and it was, I don't know, February, March, kind of the time of year where computer science interviews are done. And I got invited to Duke in Durham, North Carolina. And I flew out I left the snow in Rhode Island, and I landed in Durham, and it was like spring. Like, it was an entirely different season. And it made me so happy. And I reported back to my spouse saying, hey, it seems really nice there. And she's like, wait, it's already spring there? We should do this. And so that was my first professor job. I was at Duke in North Carolina, and it's a nice place to be.
It is a great place to be. It's where I did I did a master's degree, my first master's there while I was working full-time at Duke, and I did my master's part-time in a program called Graduate Liberal Studies, which enabled me to do this history, science, and technology studies combination. But
yeah, so why don't you kick us off with a little bit of, help us understand your background a little bit. How did you come to be thinking about computing, but from a very kind of human perspective? It's not really focused on the bits. It's focused on the people who focus on the bits.
Yes. So we have to go way back in my history to college. I was an undergrad at Dartmouth, and I double majored in math and history. And math at Dartmouth is, of course, very computational because they have a strong computer science department. And I also taught myself how to code. So I came at this world from being someone who was very interested in writing and history and social and cultural aspects, but also ended up working after graduation in tech and at the intersection of tech and education for a decade before I started full-time graduate school. And when I ended up at Yale pursuing the history of science program, and then ultimately working with someone at MIT, David Mindell, doing history of computing, it seemed like a natural fit to go back and think about how all of the students and teachers I had worked with over a decade in tech, how they shaped the technology they were using and how it impacted them in their communities. And that became the kernel of a people's history of computing in the United States.
Right. And Dartmouth played such a core role, right, in the early
Yes.
days. And they're not kind of in the top 10, 20, 50, 100 these days. But historically, like we wouldn't be in the place that we are if they hadn't done the kinds of things they were doing.
Absolutely. And Dartmouth, very much, as I write about and as I learned about, I didn't realize this as an undergrad. I should say, as an undergrad in the 90s, my memory of Dartmouth was, oh, we had email at a time when almost no one else that I knew did. So sort
So
of,
you were
and
cool.
we were cool.
Yeah.
And everybody communicated by, it was called Blitzmail. So we had Blitzmail, and that's how we all coordinated with our friends. But also we had shared printer kiosks and public computers. And it was a very wired campus at a time when that was unusual. It was only going back to research the dissertation and then write my book that I learned that really this was a vision of the math department at Dartmouth starting in the 50s, that computers were going to be really important and really important for everyone at a time when this was mainframes. And Dartmouth really, under the leadership of John Kemeny, who became president of the college, and Tom Kurtz, a great math professor, created this with students, I should say, time-sharing networking system that extended across the campus, but also around New England, and was just a way to bring computing to the people in the 60s.
Right,
Yeah.
and brought us BASIC for
Yes.
good and ill and everything in between.
Yes.
By the time you were there in the 90s, was there any BASIC footprint left at Dartmouth, or was it all just more modern stuff by then?
In like CS classes, I want to say it was C, maybe C, something like C++, but not really anyone not formally teaching and learning in BASIC, but I think people still dabbled in it. And then even today, there are like BASIC
Sure.
emulators. I mean, there's so many during the 70s, right? 70s and 80s, such a proliferation of programs in BASIC that were printed that you could just
Sure.
enter in. So yeah.
Yeah.
Enter in. Yes.
I had a subscription to Creative Computing.
Me too.
For a year or two, way back in the 70s or something.
I was just trying to explain this to somebody that back then you couldn't download stuff off the internet because there wasn't really an internet, but you could get a magazine that had printed code in it, and you could type in the code yourself.
Yeah, and there wasn't a computer, a TRS-80 in any Radio Shack in the country that I wouldn't type 10 print Davis Gray 20 go to 10 as I walked by for years because I could. Anyway,
BASIC was my native tongue. I mean, was that your first programming language too, Dave?
No, actually, Fortran 3 was my first one, like that, because, I didn't get to actual compute. Well, it depends on if you believe that the Digicomp 1, the plastic thing, counts as a computer or not. And I didn't, even though it supposedly was a counter, programmed it to be a counter. So I didn't encounter computers until high school. And we were really lucky because we were at an expensive school, expensive, at least public school, that they had an IBM 1130 and card punches and so forth in the high school. And so there were two classes that used that machine. There was the computer math class where we learned Fortran, and then there was the business computing class where they learned RPG2, report program generator, IBM's, form filler, basically. And we competed for the same machine. So my first language was Fortran in giant card decks, and I loved it. But I don't know. And so, I was looking at some of your papers, Joy, and, so you like explicitly wrote, for example, about the sort of transition from like Hidden Figures history of women in computing to the sort of Dartmouth white men kind of taking it over. And I didn't even realize that you had a personal experience with Dartmouth there. Can you unpack that a little bit? I mean, I know it's a huge thing.
Yes. Yeah. So, the shortest way I can say it is, computers used to be people, and those people were often women. So during, we'll say, the 1800s and certainly into the 1900s, computers were people who were doing lots of mathematical calculations, whether for scientific purposes, navigational purposes, insurance or business purposes. And they were often working in networks or groups. Another example is there were a group of computers at Harvard who were astronomers who were calculating, reducing data about astronomical observations. And in some ways, these networks of computers who were women were what we might think of as larger computers. For instance, I wrote about the Math Tables Project, which is a Great Depression era works project administration project to calculate mathematical tables for scientific use. And it employs many women in New York. But what's crucial about it is the way they approach the work is figuring out how to do algorithms for these complex mathematical computations and sort of how to break it down into component parts, how to check the work, and basically create a series of methods that once digital electronic computers come along a decade or so later, we'll say roughly, those same algorithms are basically implemented in the hardware. But so this was work, though, that this is what I want to emphasize. Even though women did it, it didn't mean it was underpaid, but it was underpaid because at the time, we'll say largely prior to the 20th century, it was viewed that in American culture and society, at least, that a man was the head of household responsible for providing for his dependents, whether it was his wife and children or mostly his wife and children, but that if a woman was working, it was to earn, quote, pin money for like extravagances or frills, because the popular idea was that the woman either was a daughter of someone who was providing for her or the wife of someone who's providing for her. And this falls apart for lots of reasons, but it creates this discrepancy in pay. And it also creates, for reasons we know historically, work that women do is not seen as valuable or as skilled or as requiring as much expertise as work that men do, even though many of these women often had college degrees. This was like the only kind of work they could find. And so in the 50s, as computers as we know them started coming onto the scene, or in the 40s, I should say, during and after World War II, many women were doing the work of figuring out how to program computers, how to make them work, and doing what we would recognize as coding, programming, just making things run. However, over the course of the second half of the 20th century, and my colleague Mar Hicks writes about this case in their book, Programmed Inequality, as computing becomes more prestigious and more valuable sort of in all ways, more and more men move into those roles. And it's complicated and it's multi-layered, and a people's history of computing is part of it, but really it's something too, it's a pattern that we have seen not just in computing, but in teaching, whereas teaching initially was a masculine profession, and then as it feminized, it became less sort of, we'll say, devalued in terms of pay. And computing went the other way, where it was initially a sort of pink collar, feminized profession. And then as it became more prestigious, now it's very lucrative by and large and tends to be more masculine.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting. As you were talking, one of the things that it reminded me of, which isn't gender related at all, and so maybe it's a whole separate story. I don't know, but it reminded me a little bit of the distinction between science and engineering, between scientists and engineers. And I come out of computer science. Anything that has to call itself a science probably isn't. computer scientists, secretly look down on computer engineers because it feels like they're just sort of doing the mechanics, like the computer scientists are doing the abstract ideas, the algorithms, some amazing mathematical stuff, and the engineers are just, I don't know, writing C or whatever the heck it is. And it feels to me like the women that you were talking about, the computers that were figuring out actually how to do this, actually how to come up with the next row of the table for whatever it is, especially given the fact that the computers of the day being made out of humans were not even 100% reliable. So there had to be checks built in and all kinds of things, which they then dumped when it was put onto computers like that, for good and for ill. But there was, it seems to me there's this the exaltation of the abstract and humiliation of the actual work, the implementation somehow. Do you think there's anything to that? Just came to mind.
I think this sort of the ways that, even taking computer science or computer engineering as an example, the ways that we will say professionally, culturally, socially, like draw boundaries around things and say what is more valuable or more difficult is honestly kind of arbitrary.
Or self-serving to whoever has the power. Or
self-serving to whoever has the power. Arbitrary, right? It's not arbitrary. It's very much in line with what is perceived as powerful or who is currently holding the power. And so I think I have two very concrete examples, I would say, that illustrate not just the science engineering, but are the sort of the abstract versus mundane. Mm-hmm. Mundane might be the wrong word, but quotidian, or what's actually nitty gritty. One is Davis Sobel has a book about the astronomers who are the women working at Harvard. And basically how there's literally generate years of the astronomers are men because that is perceived as looking at the sky with the telescope is the abstract scientific work. But to actually do the reductions for where a star is seen in the sky takes multiple steps, requires math, trigonometry, all of these things, but that's considered not the abstract, the grunt work. And this is what the women are doing, but then they're actually the ones who are discovering new stars and cataloging and doing what would be recognized as scientific research in terms of what are stars composed of. So the lines start getting blurry and then they get redrawn. Similarly, I love the case of in the ENIAC computer, which is the sort of what we would recognize, right, as a first modern computer. Right. Herman Goldstein is doing the abstract work of saying how he thinks this computer should work, but his wife Adele is the one who is training people on how to use it and managing the women who are doing the programming and writing the manuals. But if you read Herman's his book about this a few decades later, Adele is almost she's there, but it's very much her role was sort of oh, whatever, anybody could have done this, no big deal, even though it was absolutely crucial, not just to getting the computer run, but to teaching other people how to use the machine, to use the algorithms, to carry that knowledge beyond the ENIAC itself.
Right. Yeah. Huh. Well, yeah. Well, and then, of course, in that case, we give it all to von Neumann in the end anyway, and even Goldstein falls away, except for fans of the history.
Yes.
Like that.
Yes.
Yeah, and so in some sense, it's the hierarchy of power, and, I would say whoever writes the history gets to pick the winners, but then Goldstein wrote most of the history that's attributed to von Neumann in that stuff. And
it's interesting though. One thing I will say about this is, so first, right, von Neumann's wife, Clara, or Clary as she's known, also is doing work on these machines and quite crucial work, but because she dies soon thereafter, is sort of almost completely absent. But in both the case of Adele Goldstein and Clara von Neumann, we know about them because they were married to powerful men. So, I mean, there's also this sort of, we know that scientific couples have existed throughout history, like partnerships like this have existed throughout history. And I think it's the like work of saying like, well, if we know these very famous ones, how many others were there who don't know about? And also how many other people working alone, whether men or women, more likely to be women, do we not know about? Yeah.
Right.
So I was asked a question recently about the history of women in AI. And I don't know, is that something that you've encountered? Because obviously AI is front of mind for a lot of people these days. And so people are starting to wonder, oh yeah, how did we get here of all places? And what role have women played in making that happen?
Are there some women we could blame it on?
No, I don't think that was it.
But...
You know, that's actually, that is interesting because no one has asked me that directly as a question. And what comes to mind then is it all depends, I think, on sort of how you define AI. Like, what are we talking about, right? Are we talking about large language models, machine learning? Are we talking about all algorithmic technologies? Because I think AI often is now used as shorthand for like many things. Yeah. But so for what it's worth, I just gave last week a conference keynote for a conference on AI, and my title was Knitting Not Chess, Different Pasts and Paths for AI. And I was tracing out how and why chess became so important for the first 50 years of AI research and sort of the particular characteristics of chess, but also social and cultural characteristics that made that happen. And to jump to the end, like, basically, in some ways, it was a dead end. I mean, because of the particular algorithm that was used, this Minimax algorithm, like if we think of 1997, IBM Deep Blue's computer beats Garry Kasparov in a chess match, and it's like celebrated as this incredible accomplishment. And then John McCarthy writes in Science saying like, well, actually, this is like if the geneticists who'd been working with fruit flies to do their research, which was crucial to the development of genetics, he was like, this is like if they had just worked on creating racing fruit flies. Like we'd end up with very fast fruit flies, but not very good genetics. And in some ways, that's what chess had done. And my argument was that if we start looking back in the history of computing along lines of more diversity, whether it is gender or race, or sort of, in fact, thinking about weaving and like Herman Holler's machine, which is the first basically punch card machine for the US Census, we get this very different history, not just of computing, but AI. But I was stopping circa, 2000. And I don't know, I think it's a great question. Like who could we look to as like women of the first, we'll say 70 to 75 years of AI? Yeah.
I mean, Michael, do you know any sort of women in connectionism as far as the official folks? I mean, I can't think of one, I'm embarrassed to say.
I mean, Corinna Cortez, she was instrumental in the development of support vector machines, which was kind of at the time, this was like connectionism done right.
Yeah,
and then ultimately ended up being its own kind of dead end. But but apart from her, I mean, a lot of these conferences, there was a lot of guys.
Right.
So, I mean, it occurs to me, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this. I mean, one thing that has been very clear in the past 15 years or so is that women, particularly women of color, have been very vocal about warning about the dangers of AI or the cautions of AI.
Sure.
So whether it's Joy Bolam-Winnie or my former colleague at AI Now, Rashida Richardson, Sophia Noble, right? There are Timnit Gebru. There are many, many women who have been saying like, hold on, we know there are some problems here and they're very real and they're affecting people's lives already. So like dangerous AI isn't something of the future, it is already of the present. And I think that's actually a really important thing to note as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I guess it's thought of as a sub area of AI, but it really is a sub area of AI that was not just included some women, but like it was kind of conceptualized by women. Like there were so many women in just deciding what it is that this could be about. That it's I tried to pitch that story as a documentary to a production company. They're like, I was like, I would like to do a TV show on AI. And they're like, well, what would you want it to be about? I'm like, well, what do you think about this? They didn't ultimately bite, but I just thought, but in the process of kind of researching that, it's like, oh yeah, everybody I can think of, not to the one. I mean, there's a couple guys who've played important roles, but really that whole area has just been shaped by women.
Yes, yeah. Well, for what it's worth, I would love to see that documentary. I think it's really important. And I think it's
Yeah.
real. I mean, right, even, to have a moment of reflexivity, right? When you asked me about women in the history of AI, my first thought was like, who are the coders, right? But like, arguably, this entire group of women that we're talking about, and like Catherine D'Ignazio, Laura Klein, like they also have equally, if not more, of a role to play, because they're saying like, oh, everyone as a citizen should be aware of this and have a stake and have a voice in saying this is too big to be left to just some handful of a few
Subset,
powerful
yes.
people or companies. So yeah.
I think there's a general kind of problem with science, that scientists writ large try to make a separation from the search for knowledge and the application of knowledge. And so the folks that are taking ethics and AI seriously, for example, they're rejecting that. Basically, they're saying you can't talk about AI without talking about what it's going to do in the world that we actually live in. If we lived in some different world, then responsible AI might mean a totally different thing. But given where we are, and the same thing is true of, the atomic bomb and genetically modified organisms and you name it, like that. And so it seems like it's a bigger problem even than AI. It's partly the
Absolutely.
problem of researchers and thinkers not wanting to get their hands dirty with the uses and purposes and even the funders of their own research. And maybe we should be pushing on that itself somewhat. Maybe?
Yeah, definitely. I would, one of the things that was eye-opening to me, sort of having worked in tech for like a decade, and having this view of science as, we'll say, like values neutral, and like separate from the rest of the world. Or sort of, we have this idealized notion, I think we're taught, at least in American schools, of like the scientific method and the search for knowledge. And like science, Western science absolutely has been a very effective knowledge production system. But it is one. And one of the things in grad school that I was like mind blown is, actually, in fact, science is political. Science has funders, and those funders absolutely shape what is and isn't done and the direction of work. And scientists sit on government commissions and direct how they want money to go and use science for their own purposes. Like John Kemeny at Dartmouth, who's absolutely the consummate politician, sort of becomes president, without a doubt, it's using computing and building that network as a way to get himself more power. And I'm not saying that's like a bad thing to do, but it is certainly a political thing to do. And so I think we need absolutely more recognition that like science and tech are not divorced from the world that we inhabit. And the world that we inhabit is still very much divided along lines of power, divided along lines of gender, race, class, etc., access to resources in terms of education. And so, I was just at this conference on AI last week, and we were talking about like AI therapists. And, we were talking about going back to Joseph Weizenbaum and Eliza and whether they were good or bad. But in some cases, people seem to be finding them helpful. And I said, but it's also like, is this a wealth or class? Does this become a differentiator in terms of if you have good insurance or the resources to pay for an in-person interaction versus the AI becoming something that is a second like second best option. And I don't know if that's the case. I don't know if that's fair, but like there
know
are
which way you
lots
place
of
the bet.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
the fact of the
That's
matter. Uh, so, I mean, now it's feeling to me like it's going all the way back to the Renaissance and patrons of science. These are people who are already rich, they're already royalty or whatever, and they can dally by having some pet scientists and so forth. Or if they're so lucky, they can be their own pet scientist if they were born into it, and so on. And then we say, okay, well, that did cause an awful lot of scientific truth to be found and uncovered, and it's been world changing. The technologies that fell out of that stuff, for good and for ill, have completely changed the world that we live in. And, you know, I could see someone claiming that we should take that trade-off, that we should say, okay, you know, yes, it's going to benefit the rich people. Yes, it's going to benefit the powerful more than anything else because the rich get richer. To try to get rich, to try to take care of that problem would block doing any science at all, because that's a huge problem. You know, how do you stop? I mean, I guess you roll out the guillotine. That's how you stop that. But, you know, most people aren't there yet. And so I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm saying. I want to believe that there's some way that we could find a path to better, that we could find a path to improvement in terms of how to have people engage in science, how people expect to be the consequences of science and so forth, and engineering and pretty much everything. But I'm not sure what that could be. I'm not sure what the path to improvement could be. And which is depressing, but I mean, well, one of the other things I saw that you had written about was Montessori, and
yes.
I didn't know much about Montessori except the whole school system and everything like that. And to me, the Montessori idea seems like a step in the right direction. That what we actually need to do is educate kids in a much stronger and more holistic and more socially beneficial kind of way, so that they will grow up to be people who will automatically think about the consequences of things, because you always have to think about the consequences of things, something like that. So that could be what a path to improvement might look
Well,
like.
I think it's multiple paths to improvement, right? And it's not a perfect, it's a progress. Although
Sure.
there are certainly things, right, that concern me right now in terms of climate change and even
Right.
concerns around AI, et cetera. But like, I absolutely agree that we should be starting with kids. I mean, truly, like from pre-K, in terms of thinking about, and this is where I get overwhelmed thinking about, like, where's the conversation about what is the purpose of education now in 2024 in the United States, at least, and globally. Like, what's the purpose of education? What do we want our kids to grow up not to be, but like what kind of people? And
What
I
kind of
think
thinkers?
we've we've inherited these systems of education that are now 200, 300, more 100 years old, that come from a very different era, that when computers didn't exist, among many other things, right? When the lifespan was like 40 years if you were lucky, not 80
Right.
to 90 years. So I do, I would like to believe that having people think more holistically, and not just like there are disciplines that have boundaries, and science is one subject and English is another, and never the two shall meet, or history
Right.
is one subject and computing is
Right.
another. But rather, like, what if it's like, actually, I was just saying this to someone a few days ago, like, what if it was like a high school project was like, let's get a team of people together to think about, I don't know, what it would be like to do better cancer treatment. I mean, not like we would necessarily expect a team of high schoolers to produce, maybe they could produce meaningful answers, right? But the idea that, like, maybe how do you approach this problem is not
Right.
just one way, but thinking about patients and doctors and what people want from treatment and what kind of cancer is. I mean, but sort of like this very, what have people done in the past? How do people respond to that? I mean, one could imagine there are lots of ways to
Right. Yeah.
think about the connections. Yeah.
I mean, when I was teaching computer science, one of the things was, how much do you have individual projects and how much do you have team projects? And a lot of the good students hated the team projects because they thought they were just carrying the rest of the team along and like that. And I could understand that. But on the other hand, I was like, yeah, well, but this is part of your job.
Yes.
Part of your job is to figure out how to deal with and see what you can do with and perhaps motivate and all those things. And those are not separate from the abstract data types and the syntax errors. This is all part of it. And that, I think we needed much more in United States American education. We need a lot more of the team projects because of the socialization and the team building and all that stuff that it builds. I mean, we could do a better job teaching all of those soft skills and stuff rather than just sort of throwing people off the deep end and say, okay, I'm going to randomly roll the dice and there's your frickin' team. Now go nuts. Like that.
There's so many things I like about this idea, right? Because I've noticed this sort of learning how to work with people, right? Sort of thinking about people as the team as being the thing that lets us get stuff done, right? And that if you look at humans as opposed to other animals, like that's where we shine as a species.
That's our superpower.
We can work together in groups. It's so different from the way that we're building AI. For example, these AI systems don't generally work together well in groups. They don't work together at all. And the notion of really thinking about that as a task, that there's some people who their brilliance is you put them in a group and that group works better. Right. And it's not something that we know how to quantify very well, but it's real.
Everybody on the team knows it. I mean, certainly one of the things that I always did at the end of every group project, you had to rate your own contribution and everybody else's contribution to the project. And then when I would put these numbers together in the spreadsheet, it's usually pretty damn obvious. Everybody overstates themselves, but as far as who they assign the credit to the other folks, it's the ones that really made the project work. Like that, the ones that kept the people from running away, kept the meeting happening, and and so forth. And and I felt like that was useful as far as it went. I don't know. That's enough of that. But
can I just weigh in?
Jump.
Because I have two thoughts. One is I feel so I was definitely the person in school, at least through high school, who never wanted to be on a team because why? And my teachers let me get away with it. I graduated valedictorian. So basically by the time I was in high school, I was like, I don't want to do this group project. I'm just going to do my own thing. And I could. And I thought that was great. And now, having gone through life and work and interacting with people and teams, I see how short-sighted that was. But also now having a kid of my own, going back to school, school isn't just about learning a subject. It's really learning how to be a person with other people.
Exactly.
And I have to put a shout out here to my colleague, Vanessa Druskett, who is in my writing group, is writing a book on the emotional intelligence of teams. And basically the idea that it should be coming out from Harvard in the next year or two. But listening to her talk in our group, teams aren't accidental. In fact, you can actually put together very good teams, and it's not about changing who people are. It's recognizing that you need certain components of characteristics to make the team flourish, and that in fact they become superpower. I mean, it's like a superpower when you have a good team and everyone feels it. So I just want to say absolutely. Amen to teams. Buy Vanessa's book when it comes out.
I will read that. That sounds great.
Yes.
Yeah, I was really proud. So I watched my daughter go through college, and she she has the right kind of brain to be an excellent computer scientist, but it never spoke to her. It never was anything she wanted to do. And I was very committed from early on. Like, I want to make sure that my kids are computer scientists. That's my measure of success as a parent. And
And you know these things.
I completely failed on that dimension, but it was wonderful. She senior year she proposed to the university to do a no cut show, a musical. Whereas it's a highly competitive theatrical atmosphere, and she wasn't able to be in any shows when she was in school because it was always like the people who had actually been in movies and who also happen to be now in college, and so they ran away with all the exciting stuff. She proposed, no, I'm going to do a show that and no one gets cut. Anybody who wants to be in the show, I'm going to find
I
a way
see.
to
No
make sure
cut. I
no
see.
cut. They're going to be in the show. We will find something for them to do. They will have a good time. It will be an excellent show. And then she managed this group of like 30 staff members and 30 performers, and they all worked together, and they came, and there were issues along the way, not surprisingly, but like she navigated them, and it was fantastic. And I just thought, oh my gosh, you have a skill that is just so valuable and not always valued.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think my feeling is part of it may be, at least in the United States, is this exaltation of the individual and this exaltation of the lone genius and giving them all kinds of super credit and which, devalues so much else. And but there it is. And, I think I'm God's gift to humanity. I admit it, like that. But, I've learned to temper how often I say such things aloud, because, people might stupidly disagree with me. And so
That would be awkward for everyone.
exactly. But there it is. And that, so there was this assumption that you didn't need to learn how to work in teams. You just threw them out there. You were supposed to learn that in recess, something like that. And you were supposed to learn it law of the jungle style. There's no actual rubric that you could be graded on how well you're doing like that. And I was contrasting this with I've got a friend who married an Italian woman, and they raised their kids in Italy. And so I saw little bits and pieces of the Italian educational system. And how, they first and foremost, it was all about socialization. It was all about how they handle a difficult situation and so forth. And it's not just the sort of stuff that I had when I was a kindergarten, where I bring home a report saying he can sit quietly, plays well with others. It was a whole nother level of analysis like that, that I feel like the United States is completely missed, and that's why we end up with so many lone gunmen. And maybe it's not too late. And I feel like kids these days are being much more concerned about the how of doing things and about making the how of doing things explicit, rather than just getting on to the actual work of the work like that. And that seems to be a step in the right direction. And it's all because of social networks. So that was another topic that I wanted to bring up with you, Joy. So do you think, there's... So from my point of view, traditional computers, the CPU and RAM, the von Neumann, Goldstein report, all of that stuff, is very much about a centralized view. CPU, center, controls all the RAM and like that. And I think that's, I see it's, I can understand how to program it because, you're in charge, nothing happens except what you say, et cetera. It's great. It's very powerful. But it seems to me it's a sort of not only limited, but kind of dangerous view to let people get into their heads that everything should be this way. And I grew up thinking, if I was just the emperor of the universe, then everything would be better because I would tell people what to do and there wouldn't be all these fighting and so forth. But now on the same, as I've gotten older, I've understood much more about the idea of bottom up versus top down and networking and versus centralization. And the thing that I'm getting to here is that it's the same computer. It's still CPU and RAM.
Yes. Yes.
But it's being used in an utterly different way, such as take a bunch of them and network them together rather than say what we really need to do is just make one really big one, like that. And so the social networks is emblematic for me of, what ought to be a different way of doing it, and yet they're all centralized. Everything goes into Facebook and then back out again. Does that stimulate any thoughts?
So yes, I have multiple thoughts. But one is like, in some ways, I think of the centralized CPU story as very similar to the lone genius story in like
Yes.
science, right? Because even though an IBM mainframe running whatever, wherever, in whatever business or university was like a standalone computer, centralized, there were how many? Tens, hundreds of people who were relying on it, connecting around it. Like Tom Kurtz, when Dartmouth didn't have its own machine, was commuting by train to Cambridge, and like having a community around that computer. So what I talk about in people's history is with early time sharing, it's a central mainframe computer, but they've figured out how to program it so that multiple people can connect at the same time. They're using phone lines to network so they can be at a distance from the central computer.
Right.
But what's crucial, I think, and what I hope comes out in the book is like, it wasn't just the fact that these kids and teachers and everybody had access to the network. It was that they had access to each other.
Yes.
And that the fact that there were communities around the computer just sort of created another node of connection.
Right.
So, jumping up to today with like Facebook and the others, I have really mixed feelings. I mean, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or Snapchat or sort of any Instagram, any networking tool you can imagine, because I think, and we know research shows, for some people, these are incredible sources of like meeting community, validation, safety, trust. And in other ways, they're so harmful and there's so much harassment and disinformation and misinformation. But especially when they are in privately held hands, right? Which a lot of these time sharing networks, like one was the Minnesota statewide network, which is technically for the public good, versus Facebook, which is for Mark Zuckerberg's good, or Meta, or whatever it is now.
Right.
Like ultimately there is a fundamental tension between the idea for profit and the idea that like a person might want to use this network for their own purposes.
Right.
And I don't think those are irreconcilable, but I think there are lots of dangers there. And we know too, I think it is centralized in some ways. These are incredibly powerful, huge companies, even if we don't experience them as such. And also, I would add, like, incredibly, right, the cloud is, all of this networking is hugely costly in terms of environmental and energy resources. And like, somebody was just asking me like, oh, but if AI can save a company 10 jobs, like, doesn't that make so much sense? And I was like, well, but what if the AI is costing more than the equivalent of 10 jobs for like the energy consumption to cool the servers and run the water and all the things?
Right.
Yeah.
Not to mention that it isn't actually doing one person's job, really.
Yes. That's
Right.
a whole other story, right? It's like labor doesn't disappear. It just changes form.
Right,
So,
squishes around. Well, so that's interesting. So you're talking about, like people gathering around an IBM mainframe and sending each other little notes. Like when I was an undergrad, that was before the internet. But we had a DEC 10, we had a big DEC 10, and I ended up being a sysadmin for it by the time I was a senior. So I was behind the scenes cheese. But we would send each other messages just within that computer, and it was the whole campus basically. Well, many people like that, and it was already being very important as a way to communicate with each other. that was not telephone call and didn't have the same affordances and the same obligations as a telephone call, and blah, 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 all of this stuff. And that was as centralized as the day long. I mean, it was the mainframe, like that. So like, what's the difference between that and Facebook? Well, for one thing, right? As far as, well, in fact, there was nobody who was sitting there analyzing all the messages that were being sent through the DEC 10. And I know that because I was a system operator, like that. And nobody was even thinking that. So in that case, back in the day, it was as if going through a center or star configuration, everything goes to the center and then comes back out again, was merely an implementation convenience. It didn't actually change the underlying logic of where the information was moving. Whereas now, obviously, in Facebook and all the social networks, the illegal TikTok, everything goes through the center as an absolute requirement so that it can be mined and aggregated and so on and so forth before, oh yeah, by the way, I'll send it to whoever you wanted to send that to, like that. And so once again, it's, in some sense, the same shape technology, but now being placed into a different surrounding context and therefore having completely different consequences, completely different implications for privacy and individuality and public versus private power, and so on. I don't know. So, with the whole Twitter blowing up a few years ago, I made the jump to the Fediverse, to Mastodon, and I'm not running on Mastodon anymore. But so far it's been feeling really good. It's feeling like the Linux of social networks. The one it's got a little bigger barrier to entry. So it's more nerds and outcasts and weird genders of all flavors and so forth are all over the place. And that gives me a little bit of hope. That even if it'll come back and the forces of centralization and the forces of extreme money will come and try to ruin the Fediverse if it ever actually gets beyond a certain minimum level of success. Even if that's true down the road, where it is now, it's the Rebel Alliance, like that, where there actually isn't a center. There isn't a single center. So I don't know. I have a little hope.
I like that analogy. I like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, so
I mean, it's a weird world to be in, where sort of you can say, I, Joy Rankin, choose to not be on Facebook or not be on Twitter, but
but Facebook is on you,
right? Well, but also just like what then I need to persuade 10 or 20 or 200,000 of my friends to do the same, and
right.
I think sometimes I think some of my educational work is saying, really be more aware, let's be all more aware of the limits of these things and how we're what's being bought and sold.
Right.
Right. Full stop. But yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I haven't even been able to get Michael to get off of Twitter, so that's the limit of my ability to make the world better. But I can try to shame him in public every so often, so that's what I just did.
Definitely does that. Though I am off of Facebook, and it's biting me. This is years and years, but it is definitely biting me because I commute on an electric unicycle, which is not a very common vehicle, and I would love to have a community to talk with about it. And so I just went searching, and I'm like, oh, I found it, and it's on Facebook.
It's a Facebook.
And I'm in a community choir, and they do all their connection on Facebook, and I'm like, oh, okay, then I guess I'm just not part of that anymore.
Well then, dump Twitter.
I don't see how dumping Twitter fixes that.
No, it makes it worse, but you're already suffering.
Oh, I see. Since you're uncomfortable already.
That's right, exactly. But no, actually, I don't know. The Fediverse is a little bit special. It's something to think about. Putting up a shingle anyway, even if you don't spend much time there. And
all right.
So Joy, so what do you think? What do you think? Is there any hope? I mean, so now we've got these computers that were doing all kinds of wonderful distributed educational things, Plato and blah blah blah, all that stuff back in history, and now it's completely sold out to massive surveillance capitalism. Is there hope? What should we be looking towards going forward?
Oh, I guess I would say, of course, that, it wasn't all rosy then, and it's not all terrible now.
Yes.
And Plato was certainly right. Plato was a product of the military and the Cold War, and so was Dartmouth's computing network, for that matter. But like, there were different forces that were funding these things, and some good came out of it, and some less good. Now, I think there are still, I think people anywhere and everywhere are still trying to do good with tech and all of the tools and affordances we have. I think it's like a means potentially for getting people together and communicating. And I personally would like to see more regulation in some places and would like to see people organizing for that. But I don't think it's all bad. I think I'm an optimist in that, looking at history, whether in the short term or the longer term. I mean, for many people, life circumstances have gotten better over time. So I don't think it's all gloom and doom.
We can't forget that part, for sure.
Do you want to put a plug in for your current project? What are you working on now, and what do we have to look forward to?
Yes, yeah. So I'm working on actually 2 books right now.
Oh.
One is, yeah, this is what I am doing. One is tentatively titled Resilience and Resistance, 50 Years of American Women in STEM. And as it is about 50 years of following the lives and careers of women working in a variety of STEM fields. But they're united as they all individually or sort of collectively co-authored reports on what has been like to be working in these STEM fields over these last 5 decades. And it came out of my sort of thinking I was exaggerating, saying that we've talked about a pipeline problem in STEM since longer than I was, before I was born. And in fact, we have been talking about a pipeline problem in STEM since before I was born, but now it's really sort of elevating and bringing out the voices of women, especially women of color, and what their experiences are, what they see as the problems, as well as the solutions. One of which, related to this conversation, is like much better holistic investment in pre-K childcare and early education. So that's like consistent over 50 years. The other book is about women, technology, and work over the past 2 centuries, with an emphasis on computing. And I'm not going to say more than that, but it's
a teaser.
How long are we going to have to wait for it?
The second book, goodness, let's see.
What you're saying versus what your editor is saying.
Oh no, all of my editors will say that I am the person who is on deadline. If I set a deadline, I make it. So I did with my first book, and I expect to with these as well.
Hardcore.
So let me I'm just thinking, like, what year is this again?
24.
2 years. 2 years for the second book, and then so a little 26. Longer for. Yeah.
All right. Well, so that's that. You're gonna have to come back and plug it again when we're a little closer.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, Joy, I hadn't met you before. I'm really happy to have met you. This was a lot of fun having this chat.
Yes, I enjoyed it as well. It was a pleasure meeting you and speaking with both of you. I also had a blast.
This was Computing Up. Thanks for listening.